Hi, this is Kim Siebold. I just wanted to warn you before I get started that this is probably not going to be one of my most brilliant lectures. As you can tell, I kind of have a cold or the flu or something. So if something is confusing, please email me and let me know so I can fix it. Thanks. All right, so what I want to do today is talk about social history and what social history is. And in the last lecture, I talked about how um, you have local history, and then above that, you could have regional history, and then state history, and then national history, and then world history. So I'm trying to get you to see that history is made up of different layers, and how you look at those layers, helps to put everything else beneath it into its proper context. And social history is much the same way. Um, Within social history, we have family history, nearby history, local history, and public history. So let's start by talking a little bit about family history and what it is. So again, we're looking at layers. So within you could have social history at the world level, you could have social history at the state level, local history at the regional level, social history at the regional level, and social history in a microcosm down to family history. So I just want you to understand that idea of different layers. Okay, so family history is about family life and relationships that focus on one family or multiple families. And it is comprised of history shared or experienced within a family group. And it can also be a collective look at families in a certain time period. This is important because this also kind of gets at the two different types of projects that one can do for this class. You could do an individual family history, all right, and the first two definitions here kind of uh, are linked to looking just at your individual family, all right, and then the offshoots of those families. Family, the last definition here, family history can also be a collective look at families in a certain period of time. That would be taking and looking at not just individual families, but families across the board. So let's say you were going to do a family history project that looked at the trends of um, gender roles, household, what did women do as opposed to what men did. You could look at that at from a national level, and you could collect information about all these different families, and then you could draw conclusions, look for patterns, that sort of thing. So I just kind of wanted you to understand that there's kind of two approaches to this. The first two definitions here, in some ways, are more genealogy. The second is something more um, something more that a scholarly historian would look at. Um, and I should say that the third definition here helps to put the first two definitions into their proper context. I hope that makes sense. All right, now, nearby history is the history of the immediate world that surrounds an area of study. Okay, so it includes the world with which we are most familiar, such as family, home, neighborhood, community, and local organizations and government. So if you take those first two definitions of family history and you want to expand out and put that family into its historical context, then you're going to actually be addressing the issues of nearby history. You're going to be looking at the things that influenced those individual families. All right. So again, if you look at something that your grandparents did and you're wondering why in the world did they do that, you want to look at what's going on during the time period that they lived to better understand what's going on. And I should say, not just look at the time period in which they lived, but look at the local area, the history of the local area in which they lived. So if you want to understand the idea of what's going on with your family, then you're going to want to look at their neighborhood. You're going to want to look at their community, like Presque Isle, stuff like that. Okay. Oops, this skipped a it skipped a thing. Hold on, let me see if I can get it to go back. Sorry. Okay, so what is local history? Well, local history and nearby history are really very similar, but again, if you think about history as like those nesting dolls, you put the small one inside and then you put the next larger one over it and then the next larger one over it and so on. That's what I'm trying to get you to see here. So local history is a study of a geographical area, usually a community. So it's not necessarily just a neighborhood or something like that. It would be more of like the town or the county. It analyzes aspects of a particular community, such as what everyday life was like, the growth or decline of industry, specific events that took place. It might look at a particular person who played an important role in the community, and it would look at how the community changed over time. So all of these things help to put nearby history into its larger context. So what is public history? Well, public history is basically sharing historical findings to the general public. So what you're doing is you're presenting it in such a way that most people who are not who have not studied history, who are not historians, can understand it. Newspapers, magazines, popular magazines, they shoot for an 8th grade reading level, and that's about what public history does. When it's thinking about how do we present this material so that most everyone in the country can understand what's going on, and that's what public history is. So, and then again, it's usually history that occurs outside of the academic realm. So if you've ever picked up an academic history book, you'll notice that it reads much different than a public history book. Okay, textbooks are somewhere in between the academic and the general public. So, okay. Museum tours and public events that focus on a segment of the past come to mind as examples. So that's public history. National Park Service, when it creates historical tours or something like that, that's public history. When somebody has cataloged a cemetery and then written something about the cemetery for most everyone else to understand, that's public history. Right? So it's just history presented in a format that the general public can understand. So social history is the study of ordinary people's everyday lives. So here you've got kind of the biggest of the nesting dolls. Social history encompasses all of these other types of history that we've talked about, that I just talked about. Social history really gets its start in after the 1960s. 1960s, we have the Civil Rights Movement, we have the Women's Movement. Early 70s, we have the American Indian Movement. All of those things help to, what we want to say, democratize history and other fields of study. But basically, historians move away from the study of dead, white, rich males. And they start looking at the history of everyday people and noticing that history has as much value as the history of, say, Thomas Jefferson or George Washington. So social history is the history from the bottom up instead of the top down, and it looks at historical events as they affected groups collectively, not just as they affected exceptional people individually. So it's looking at how did the Great Depression, for example, affect the small farmers across the United States. not just how did the Great Depression affect uh, the Vanderbilts or the Morgans, which were very, very wealthy people at that point in time. So we're looking at how these bigger events affect the common person. And we're providing a framework for understanding the lives of common people. And I mean, just everyday people, people like you and me, people who are not necessarily famous. All right. Now, in order to understand or study social history, you want to look at different things. All right. So here's something called what we call the elements of social history. So when you're studying social history, and this is something you can think about for your projects, you want to look at it from these different perspectives. So what place did a person live in? What was their homeland? What was their region, their town, their city, their countryside, their neighborhood? Do they have a sense of place or a sense of belonging to a certain area? Look at the architecture. What kind of materials were used? What kind of landscaping did they have? What kind of designs were there? Time and season refers to the way things are determined by time and season. We don't necessarily do that nowadays because we have clocks and we have common times and all that stuff. But before we had standard time, each community based their timing on the setting of the sun and the rising of the sun. So that would change, what somebody's doing in Maine versus what somebody's doing in Florida, say in January, right? Because the sun would be in different places. In terms of there would be more light there would be more light in Florida than there would be here, because we have a very short daytime in the winter. You also will determine things by season. What you did was based on the season that you were in. There were certain chores that were done at certain times of the year. They'd also look at climate changes, seasonal events, things of that sort. Family would look at the family structure, the division of labor, who had most power, that sort of thing. Marriage, we look at the ceremonies, the relationships, the gender roles, child raising. You look at things like birth, patterns of birth. How were people born? Was it with a midwife? Was people alone? Were they born in their homes? Were they born in a hospital? That sort of thing. You want to look at medical care for children. You want to look at whether children were considered to be part of the workforce. How did children play? Did they have pets? Did they have toys? That sort of thing. Old age and death. We're looking again at how did people care for the elderly? How did they prepare for death? Did they have a wake after the person died? That sort of thing. Religion, it would again be how would the religious beliefs affect a person? Would there be a church? Was the church the center of the community? That sort of thing. So I think you get a sense from me talking about all of this. So I'm not going to go on through the rest of them, but I hope that you get a sense of what these elements of social history are, and hope that it helps you think in a mindset that gets you started for thinking about, okay, if I'm going to do my family's history, then these are kinds of the things I need to address when I'm looking at my family's history. All right, these, what kind of documents, what kind of artifacts can I find that would help me do that? Hold on, I've got to pause this for just a minute.